What happens when a strict HOA board member calls 911 on her own neighbor, only to find out the man she accused is the father of the deputy who responds? Imagine standing on your own porch, adjusting the keypad lock you just installed to keep your family safe, when someone from down the street suddenly grabs the handle of your front door as if it belonged to them. That's exactly what happened to Anthony Durand, a 49-year-old electrician living in Mesa, Arizona. It was a Sunday afternoon in late spring, the kind where kids were pedaling bikes between cul-de-sacs and the smell of barbecue drifted from backyards. For Anthony, it should have been a peaceful day. But instead, he found himself staring at his neighbor, Lorraine Pritchard, the woman who chaired the HOA board, her hand tugging hard on his doorknob. Anthony stepped closer. "Lorraine, what are you doing?" His voice wasn't angry yet, just firm. Lorraine barely turned her head. "Checking." That lock wasn't there before. This property could be abandoned, or worse, broken into. Anthony blinked. "I live here." You know that Lorraine's lips pressed tight. She pulled her phone from her handbag and began swiping. Anthony recognized the 911 screen almost instantly. Inside the house, Anthony's wife Charlotte peeked through the blinds. "What on earth is going on out there?" she called. "HOA business," Lorraine snapped, as though that explained everything. Her finger hovered above the call button. "We can't have strangers moving in without clearance. Rules are rules." Anthony felt his stomach twist. He'd worked hard for this house. For his 2-story brick place with the front yard, he landscaped himself every Saturday. He paid his dues like everyone else. Yet here he was, treated like an intruder. Before Anthony could stop her, Lorraine pressed the button and began speaking rapidly to the dispatcher. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity at 4022 East El Morro Drive. There's a man trying to get into the house, and I don't think he belongs here." She gave Anthony a quick glance, as if daring him to argue. Anthony muttered, "This is absurd." Charlotte opened the front door, stepping onto the porch with crossed arms. "If you think we don't belong here, then you've lost touch with reality." Lorraine lifted her chin, phone still to her ear. "Ma'am, please step back inside for your safety." That was the final straw. Anthony laughed bitterly. "For her safety? She's my wife." Children down the street had stopped riding their bikes, drawn by the tension. A couple of neighbors emerged from their driveways, curious. The air grew heavy, not with silence, but with judgment, an entire cul-de-sac turning into an audience. Anthony tried reason. "Lorraine, you've lived here long enough to know who I am. You've seen me mow this lawn. You've waved when I pulled this truck into the driveway. Why are you doing this?" Lorraine didn't answer directly. "We have procedures. I can't risk being wrong." Charlotte's voice cut sharper than her husband's. "What you're risking is humiliating yourself in front of this entire neighborhood." But Lorraine stood rigid, convinced of her righteousness. The dispatcher had promised to send an officer. That was all she needed to hear. Anthony ran a hand over his face, torn between anger and disbelief. His house, his door, his life, suddenly being called into question by a woman who believed HOA authority gave her the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. Inside his chest, a strange mix of emotions battled. Frustration, embarrassment, a slow, creeping sense that no matter what he said, it wouldn't matter until someone else validated him. Someone in uniform. And that was the cruelest part. Because the officer on the way wasn't just a cop from the county. It was his son. But what Anthony didn't know yet was that this 911 call would not only test his patience, it would expose something deeper about perception, authority, and the way neighbors see one another. The 911 dispatcher's voice carried through Lorraine's phone speaker as she gave her report. She stood at the edge of Anthony's porch like she was protecting the entire neighborhood, though to everyone else it looked more like she was making a spectacle. "Yes, he's still here," she repeated to the dispatcher. "He says he lives here, but I don't recognize him." "Please send someone quickly." Anthony spread his hands wide. "You don't recognize me." "Lorraine, for crying out loud, you borrowed jumper cables from me last winter when your car battery died." Charlotte added, "And we brought soup to your place when you had the flu." "But sure, go ahead and tell the police we're strangers." Neighbors whispered across driveways now. The Reynolds family across the street stood with folded arms, while Mr. Johnson leaned against his mailbox like he was watching live theatre. A cluster of kids sat on the curb, helmets still strapped on, their bikes abandoned. Anthony sighed heavily and said under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Then louder, "When they get here, you'll regret this." Lorraine ignored him, walking a few steps away to finish her call in private. She spoke in a hushed but urgent tone, her voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear snippets. "Man on the porch? Can't open the door. Says he lives here. I don't buy it." Inside his chest, Anthony felt the frustration settle into something heavier. He'd lived through uncomfortable moments before, side comments at supply stores, the occasional lingering look at restaurants. But this was different. This was his own neighborhood, his own front porch, his family watching as his legitimacy was put on trial by a woman who refused to see him for who he was. Charlotte placed her hand on his arm. "Don't let her get under your skin." "I'm not trying to," he said, his voice low. "But this is crossing a line." Lorraine's phone finally clicked off. She slipped it back into her purse, adjusting her sunglasses with exaggerated composure. "They'll be here any minute. Then we'll see who's right." The faint rumble of tires on asphalt broke the tension. A patrol SUV turned the corner, sunlight flashing across the windshield. Conversations hushed instantly. Children shuffled back. Neighbors who had been bold enough to gawk from their lawns suddenly pretended to check their mailboxes or pull weeds. Anthony straightened his shoulders, bracing himself for whatever came next. Charlotte whispered, "Stay calm. Just stay calm." The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the Durand home, and the driver's door opened. A tall, uniformed deputy stepped out, his badge catching the light. His expression was focused, professional. But as soon as his eyes landed on Anthony, something flickered across his face, recognition mixed with disbelief. "Dad?" The word sliced through the quiet like a clap of thunder. Neighbors froze, turning their heads in unison. Lorraine blinked behind her sunglasses, suddenly thrown off balance. Anthony exhaled slowly, almost relieved. "Julian." Deputy Julian Durand, Anthony's 28-year-old son, walked up the driveway, his boots steady against the pavement. His tone was calm, measured, but his jaw tightened with every step. "I got a call about a suspicious person. I didn't expect it to be my own father." Charlotte smiled faintly, though her eyes still burned with anger. "Good to see you, Julian." Lorraine's mouth opened, but for the first time all day, she couldn't form a sentence. Julian turned toward her. "You made the call?" "Yes," Lorraine managed, her voice faltering. I thought he was breaking in." Julian's brows drew together. "You thought my dad, standing on his own porch, was breaking in?" Anthony folded his arms. "That's exactly what she thought." Charlotte added, sharper. "And she tried the door herself before calling." "Who does that?" Julian glanced back at the patrol car, then at the growing group of spectators. He lowered his voice, though the weight of it carried. "Ma'am, this is not a case of suspicious activity. This is a homeowner standing in front of his own house." Lorraine adjusted her sunglasses again, searching for composure. "I was only looking out for the neighborhood. It's my responsibility as part of the board." "No," Julian said firmly. "Your responsibility is to enforce guidelines fairly, not to call the police on a man you've known for years because you convinced yourself he didn't belong." A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Anthony and Julian. The Reynolds kids whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's his son?" Anthony took a deep breath. The anger hadn't gone away, but seeing his son there, his own blood in uniform standing up for him, felt like something breaking open, a truth spilling out into daylight. Lorraine tried once more. "Deputy, I didn't mean any harm." Julian didn't budge. "You need to understand how dangerous a call like that can be. Dispatch sends us expecting a threat. My father could have been treated like one if another officer had shown up instead of me." The crowd murmured. For the first time, Lorraine looked smaller, less certain of herself. Anthony stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she and Julian could hear. "Do you realize how humiliating this is? Being questioned about whether I belong in my own home?" Lorraine's face tightened, but she said nothing. Julian gave her a long look before turning back to his father. "You okay?" Anthony nodded slowly, though his jaw stayed clenched. "I will be, but this wasn't the end." Because the real question wasn't just about Lorraine's call, it was about what the neighborhood had witnessed and what they would say once the uniforms left. Anthony had never felt the weight of silence press against him the way it did now. The street, usually filled with the chatter of kids or the distant hum of lawnmowers, was locked on him, his wife, his neighbor, and his son. It was as if the cul-de-sac had turned into a courtroom, every driveway a jury box. Julian stayed composed, his posture square and steady. His uniform didn't just represent authority, it amplified every word he spoke. "Let's make this clear," he said, scanning the neighbors who lingered close enough to hear. "This man lives here. His name is Anthony Durand. He pays his dues. He maintains this property. He is not suspicious." And he never was. Anthony swallowed hard, watching Lorraine shift uncomfortably in her sandals. He wanted her to apologize, to say something, anything, that would make sense of why she had humiliated him in front of everyone. Instead, Lorraine stiffened her shoulders. "I was following my instincts. If something had been wrong, and I hadn't acted, people would be blaming me. I can't win either way." Charlotte's voice cut sharp through the air. "This isn't about instincts, Lorraine. It's about assumptions. Assumptions that nearly branded my husband a criminal." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, neighbors exchanging quick, uneasy glances. Some looked sympathetic toward Anthony. Others kept their arms crossed, unwilling to take sides. But no one walked away. They were hooked into the spectacle, as if their daily routines had suddenly been replaced with front-row seats to a drama that said more about their community than anyone wanted to admit. Anthony stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with frustration. "You've lived here long enough to know me. You've waved to me. You've talked about your grandkids with me. Yet when you see a new lock, suddenly I'm a stranger. Do you know what that feels like?" Lorraine's lips parted, but no words followed. She glanced at the crowd, then at Julian, as though searching for support. Julian didn't move. He let the silence do the work. Finally, Lorraine muttered, "I wasn't sure." That's all. Anthony shook his head slowly. "Not sure? You called 911 because you weren't sure. Do you realize what could have happened if you got someone else instead of my son? Guns drawn on my front porch because you couldn't be bothered to ask me directly." The truth of his words hit the group hard. A neighbor from 2 houses down, Mrs. Callahan, finally spoke up. "He's right. I watched the whole thing. You grabbed his door, Lorraine. You treated him like he didn't belong here." Anthony turned his head slightly, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to step in. Mrs. Callahan adjusted her cardigan and added, "I may not always agree with Anthony about the landscaping rules, but he's our neighbor. We all know that." That single voice cracked the ice. More whispers spread, but this time they weren't against Anthony. They were against Lorraine's decision. Julian shifted his weight, his eyes steady on Lorraine. "You've got to understand, Mom. This isn't just about rules. It's about respect. If people can't feel safe in their own homes, then what kind of community do you think you're building?" Lorraine finally let out a long breath. Her sunglasses slid down slightly, revealing her eyes. Tired, defensive, but now tinged with something else. Regret, maybe. She cleared her throat. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." Charlotte didn't let her off easy. "Protecting it from what? From your own neighbor standing on his porch?" Anthony let the silence stretch again, waiting. Lorraine avoided his eyes. From the corner, a teenager holding his bike finally whispered, "That was messed up." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough to make Lorraine flinch. Anthony turned to Julian. "What happens now?" Julian looked at his father, then at the crowd, then finally at Lorraine. "What happens now is a choice. But I'm going to write a report because the call was made. And people need to understand that misusing 911 wastes resources that could have been used for real emergencies." Lorraine's eyes widened. "A report?" "Yes," Julian replied evenly. "That's standard. And it should make you think twice before you use law enforcement as your first option instead of your last." The tension grew thick again, but this time Anthony felt the ground shifting. The humiliation was still there, but it wasn't his anymore. It was Lorraine's. And everyone was watching her wear it. Anthony glanced around at the neighbors. Some gave him small nods of acknowledgement, others looked away, uncomfortable with the rawness of what they had witnessed. But either way, the message was clear. The story wasn't just about a lock-on, but even as Julian's words seemed to settle the conflict, Anthony knew the true test wasn't what had been said in the moment. It was what the neighborhood would carry forward after the police car left. The patrol SUV sat parked at the curb, its presence a reminder that this wasn't just a neighborhood squabble. It was now on record, logged in the system, stamped with a case number that could follow Lorraine longer than she expected. Anthony crossed his arms, his eyes still fixed on her. You know, Lorraine, I've worked my whole life to keep my family safe. I put in extra hours, saved every dime, just so we could live in a place where we wouldn't have to look over our shoulders. And yet here I am, defending my right to stand on my own porch. Lorraine shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her authority, so solid when she grabbed his doorknob and dialed 911, was crumbling under the weight of Anthony's words. I didn't mean it that way, she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice carrying through the circle of neighbors. Then how did you mean it? Because from where I'm standing, it looked like you decided Anthony wasn't allowed to be here. And worse, you dragged the police into it instead of knocking on the door and asking a simple question. Julian kept his stance calm but strong. He was a lawman, but tonight he was also a son. And every word cut him in two. He was trained to de-escalate, to handle disputes with authority. But watching his father stand accused in his own yard, in front of strangers and neighbors alike, struck him in a place his badge couldn't protect. Anthony's voice dropped, low and raw. You've known me for years. You know my work truck. You've seen me fixing things for neighbors, volunteering when the HOA needed help. And yet, the second something didn't look right to you, I became a threat. The crowd shifted again. A few murmured words floated through the air, almost like background noise. Anthony could catch pieces. He's right. Always strict. Went too far this time. Each one stung Lorraine like nettles, though she tried to mask it behind her stiff posture. Lorraine finally shot back, her voice cracking. I was scared, all right? Maybe I overreacted, but I thought I was doing what's best for everyone. Julian didn't let her off the hook. Scared of what, exactly? My father standing on his porch? A keypad lock on a door? Ma'am, if you can't answer that honestly, then maybe you should ask yourself why you picked up that phone in the first place. The silence that followed was harsher than any argument. Even the kids on the curb, who had been whispering and fidgeting earlier, went still. Anthony finally exhaled, the frustration in his chest turning into something else. Weariness. Do you realize the damage this does? Every time someone sees me as suspicious in my own home, it chips away at the idea of community. How are we supposed to trust one another when trust only flows one way? Charlotte added softly. Respect shouldn't be optional. It should be the foundation. Lorraine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face was red now, her carefully built image as the neighborhood's watchful guardian cracking in full view of everyone. Mrs. Callahan, still standing with her arms folded, finally spoke again. We all saw it. And I think it's time we stop pretending that this was about safety. Lorraine, this was about control. And control isn't the same as caring for the community. A ripple of agreement passed through the group. Someone coughed. Another neighbor muttered, Exactly. And suddenly the air didn't feel as heavy for Anthony. For the first time, the weight of humiliation wasn't pressing down on him. It was shifting onto the one who had started it all. Julian turned to his father. Do you want to press this further? You've got the right to file an additional complaint if you choose. Anthony shook his head. No, not right now. What I want is for her to think about what she did. That'll last longer than paperwork. Lorraine swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, to insist she had only meant well. But the words stuck in her throat. Anthony locked eyes with her. You owe my family an apology. Not just to me, but to every person who had to watch this circus because you decided to call the police instead of walking next door. The neighbors nodded. quietly but firmly. The pressure wasn't coming from Anthony alone anymore. The community was turning, and Lorraine could feel it. She lowered her sunglasses completely, no longer hiding behind them. Her voice was quieter now, almost fragile. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called. I should have talked to you first. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot." The crowd began to thin, but not before everyone had seen enough to carry their own version of the story back into their homes. Curtains twitched as neighbors slipped away, some whispering in pairs, others pretending they had only wandered outside by coincidence. What was left was a quiet street, the patrol SUV's lights still flashing in muted cycles across the houses. Julian turned back to his father, his shoulders softening now that the confrontation had diffused. "Dad, are you sure you don't want to take this further? People need to understand that this kind of thing has consequences." Anthony rubbed a hand across his face. The exhaustion of the moment hit him like a wave. "I don't want to drag this through the system, son. I've been working all week. And now this? I just want to go inside, sit down, and breathe." Charlotte touched his arm gently. "We'll deal with it together. Right now, you need to rest." Julian looked between them, then at Lorraine, who lingered a few feet away. Her eyes stayed down, the energy drained from her body. The proud stance she had held earlier had collapsed into something almost apologetic, though not fully. She was a woman used to authority, and authority was not easily surrendered. Julian's voice carried, calm but stern. "Ma'am, I'll be filing the report. That's procedure. But I'll also note that the homeowner was cooperative, respectful, and in no way threatening. You need to know how dangerous this could have been," Lorraine whispered, almost to herself. "I understand." Anthony tilted his head. "Do you? Because understanding means you change. Otherwise, it's just words." Her lips pressed together, no reply coming. Julian gave his father one last look. "I'll handle the paperwork. I'll stop by tomorrow, off duty, to check on you both." Anthony nodded. "Thanks, son. You did good tonight." For a moment, father and son locked eyes, not as officer and civilian, but as family bound together in a moment they never asked for. Julian gave a small, respectful nod before heading back to his vehicle. The SUV rumbled to life, rolling slowly down the street until its lights disappeared around the bend. The silence that followed was thick, but different now. The drama had ended, but the aftertaste lingered. Lorraine stood alone, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Anthony finally spoke, his voice quieter but edged with truth. "Do you know what I'm going to remember about tonight? Not the call, not even the flashing lights. I'll remember standing here, in front of my own home, and wondering if my neighbors believed I belonged." Charlotte stepped closer, her voice softer but unwavering. "And I'll remember you trying to strip away our dignity with a phone call." Lorraine's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. The words had already been spoken, the truth already laid bare. Anthony turned toward his door, typing the code into the new lock with deliberate slowness. The keypad beeped, the deadbolt clicked, and the sound echoed through the cul-de-sac like a statement. "This is my house. This is my family. And no one will tell us otherwise." Charlotte followed him inside, glancing once over her shoulder. Lorraine remained rooted in place, still struggling with her own reflection in the eyes of the neighbors who had witnessed everything. Inside the Durand home, the air was heavy with relief and fatigue. Anthony dropped onto the couch, staring at the floor. Charlotte brought him a glass of water and sat beside him. "You handled yourself," she said softly. "Even when everything in you wanted to lash out, you stood tall." Anthony shook his head slowly. "I don't know if that's strength or just being tired of fighting battles like this." Charlotte reached for his hand. "Maybe it's both." Anthony leaned back, closing his eyes. He thought of Julian. His son, standing in uniform, defending his father not as family alone, but as a man who deserved respect. It filled him with pride, but also sadness. Pride that his son had risen to that role. Sadness that it had been necessary at all. Charlotte spoke again, quieter now. "This neighborhood saw everything tonight. Let's see if they remember it tomorrow." Anthony exhaled deeply. "They'll remember. People always remember the moments when masks come off. Question is, will they learn from it? From outside, a car door shut, followed by the faint sound of footsteps fading into the night. The world was moving on, but inside their home, the memory had already settled in like a scar that wouldn't fade. But scars can teach as much as they hurt, and Anthony knew the true lesson wasn't just for Lorraine. It was for every neighbor who stood by and watched, waiting to decide which side they were on. By sunrise, the story had already spread through the subdivision like wildfire. People didn't need text chains or social media for news to travel, just open blinds and early morning coffee chats over fences. Anthony stepped out onto his porch at 7, coffee mug in hand, the keypad lock glinting in the morning light. He didn't even need to wonder who was watching. He could feel eyes from across the street, curtains shifting as neighbors peeked out. Charlotte joined him, hair pulled back, a robe cinched tight. She glanced around and whispered, "You'd think folks never saw a man drink coffee before." Anthony gave a humorless chuckle. "Last night gave them a show they'll be chewing on for weeks." He bent down to grab the newspaper from the mat, straightened, and noticed someone walking toward him. It was Mrs. Callahan, cardigan buttoned despite the rising heat. "Morning, Anthony," she said, her tone softer than usual. "Morning." She hesitated, then added, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry you went through that. You've been a good neighbor. Everyone knows it, even if not everyone says it." Anthony studied her for a moment, searching for sincerity. "I appreciate that, but you stood up last night." "That mattered." Mrs. Callahan's lips pressed together. "I wish more had." She gave a small wave and shuffled back toward her house. Charlotte leaned against the railing. "One down, 30 more to go." Anthony smirked faintly, though his eyes stayed tired. "We'll see how many keep their silence when it's convenient." Across the street, the Reynolds kids were climbing into their SUV for school. The oldest, a boy no more than 12, called out, "Mr. Durand! Your son's a cop?" That was crazy last night. Their mother quickly hushed him, tugging him into the car. She gave Anthony an awkward smile before driving off. Charlotte shook her head. "Kids have more courage than their parents sometimes." Anthony took another sip of coffee. "Sometimes honesty comes easier when you're young." By mid-morning, the HOA email list lit up with chatter. Charlotte read them aloud at the kitchen table while Anthony tightened a loose cabinet hinge. "Listen to this," she said. "We need to discuss what happened last night at the next board meeting. It reflects poorly on our community." "That one's from Mr. Johnson." Anthony rolled his eyes. "Reflects poorly." More like revealed what's been under the surface. Another email pinged in. Charlotte sighed, scrolling. "Here's one from Lorraine. She's calling it a misunderstanding. Says she acted in the neighborhood's best interest, but regrets the distress it caused." Anthony stopped, screwdriver in hand. "A misunderstanding?" She grabbed my door like she owned it, called 911, and had half the block watching me get treated like a suspect. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice." Charlotte reached over, covering his hand. "I know. And deep down, so does she. But she'll never say it the way it should be said." The phone rang. Anthony answered, recognizing his son's voice. "Dad, just checking in." "How you doing?" Anthony hesitated, then said, "Tired," but standing Julian's tone softened. "That's all I needed to hear." I filed the report. "It won't go further unless you want it to. But it's on record." "Good," Anthony replied. "Not because I want her punished, but because it needs to be real, not just gossip." Julian paused. "That's why I became a cop, Dad. To make sure things are real, not rumors or assumptions. You deserved better than last night." Anthony's chest tightened. Pride, frustration, and love mixed into one. "I'm glad it was you, son. I don't want to think about how it could have gone if it wasn't." Julian let the silence sit for a moment before replying, "Neither do I." They hung up, and Anthony stood in the kitchen staring at the keypad lock again. Something so small, a simple upgrade, had turned into a symbol. A line drawn in the sand. Charlotte walked over and slipped her arm through his. "So, what now?" Anthony exhaled slowly. "Now, we live. We keep walking outside every morning, drinking our coffee, saying hello, and reminding everyone watching that this is our home. They don't get to take that away." She kissed his cheek. "That's the man I married." Anthony smiled faintly, though his eyes carried the weight of the night before. But even as the morning sun warmed the street, he knew shadows lingered. A week later, folding chairs scraped against the tiled floor of the Mesa Community Center as neighbors trickled in for the monthly HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were uneventful, talk of landscaping guidelines, overdue fees, and whether holiday decorations stayed up too long. But tonight, every seat filled. People who rarely showed up were suddenly eager participants. Anthony sat near the back with Charlotte, arms crossed, expression steady but guarded. He wasn't there for policy debates. He was there for accountability. At the front of the room, Lorraine adjusted her stack of papers, her posture tight. She wore a blazer that looked more formal than usual, as though dressing the part might help restore authority. Her voice, when she began, carried a rehearsed calm. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. We have a few items on the agenda. Maintenance updates, budget allocations, and, of course, the recent incident that has stirred some concerns." Murmurs rippled through the room. Anthony felt Charlotte's hand squeeze his knee under the table. Lorraine cleared her throat. "I want to begin by clarifying that my actions were guided by a sense of duty to protect our neighborhood. I recognize that my judgment may have caused distress, and I regret any misunderstanding." A hand shot up before she could continue. It was Mrs. Callahan, sitting near the middle. "With respect, Lorraine, it wasn't a misunderstanding. We all saw what happened. You grabbed a man's door and called the police on your own neighbor." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Lorraine's face tightened. "Mrs. Callahan, I appreciate your input, but no!" Mrs. Callahan cut her off. "You don't get to minimize this. You treated Anthony like he didn't belong here. That's not neighborhood protection. That's prejudice." The words landed like a stone dropped into a pond, ripples spreading through the crowd. Anthony felt heat rise in his chest, not from anger this time, but from the weight of someone else saying what he'd carried for days. Lorraine tried to maintain composure. "I assure you there was no prejudice in my decision. It was simply concern." Another voice chimed in. Mr. Johnson, the same neighbor who had leaned against his mailbox during the incident. "Concern doesn't explain why you didn't recognize a man you've lived next to for nearly a decade. Concern doesn't explain why your first instinct was 911 instead of knocking on the door." The tension in the room thickened. Lorraine's gaze darted across the crowd, looking for an ally, but found none. Even those who had once admired her strictness now seemed uncomfortable in their seats. Charlotte leaned toward Anthony, whispering, "They're saying it now." Out loud, Anthony nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the front. Finally, Lorraine's voice cracked just enough to reveal the strain. "I admit I overreacted. I misjudged the situation, but I only wanted what was best." Anthony stood. His chair scraped against the floor, silencing the room. He spoke slowly, deliberately, every word aimed like a beam of light cutting through fog. "What was best for who, Lorraine? Because it wasn't best for my wife, watching her husband accused in front of his own house. It wasn't best for my son, who had to respond as a deputy and confront his own father like a stranger. And it sure wasn't best for me, standing on my porch while you made me prove I belonged." A hush fell over the room. Lorraine looked down at her notes, but Anthony pressed on. "I've spent years here. Paid my dues, helped my neighbors, fixed wiring for folks when they couldn't afford an electrician. And yet one keypad lock was all it took for me to become suspicious in your eyes. That's not a mistake. It's a mindset. And until that mindset changes, this community isn't safe. Not for me. Not for anyone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs." Charlotte's eyes glistened as she watched her husband speak. Mrs. Callahan nodded firmly. A few others clapped softly. Hesitant at first, but growing louder as the words sank in. Lorraine finally raised her head, her face pale. I can't undo what I did, but I hear you." Anthony let the silence stretch before replying. "Hearing isn't enough. Change comes when you act differently next time. When you choose conversation over suspicion, respect over control." The applause grew louder now, spreading through the room until even the hesitant voices joined in. Lorraine sat back, lips pressed tight, unable to argue further. Anthony returned to his seat, his heart pounding. He hadn't planned to speak, but once the words began, they carried the truth that had burned inside him since that night. Charlotte leaned close and whispered, "That's the man I married." But he knew the story wasn't finished. The real test would come not in a meeting room filled with words, but in the everyday actions of neighbors deciding whether they would live those words when porch lights went on and fences needed mending. The HOA meeting ended with chairs scraping back and neighbors shuffling toward the exit, their conversations hushed but charged. For once, people weren't talking about lawn heights or paint colors. They were talking about what had really happened, what they had really seen. Anthony and Charlotte walked out together, the desert air still warm even after sundown. They didn't say much at first. The weight of the meeting clung to them, heavy but strangely liberating. Anthony had spoken, and this time, people had listened. In the parking lot, Mrs. Callahan caught up with them. "Anthony," she said, slightly out of breath, "I just want you to know, your words mattered tonight." People needed to hear them. Anthony nodded. "Thank you, but words are easy. I'm more interested in what comes next." She smiled faintly. "Fair enough. But change doesn't start without someone speaking first." With that, she patted his shoulder and walked toward her car. Charlotte slipped her hand through his arm as they made their way to their truck. "You moved the room, Anthony. Don't downplay it." He didn't answer right away. He was remembering the looks on his neighbors' faces. Some ashamed, some supportive, some unreadable. He knew people would leave the meeting with different interpretations. Some would call it overreaction, others a wake-up call. And somewhere in the middle, truth would wrestle with convenience. The following days proved him right. When Anthony went out to mow his lawn, a few neighbors waved with more warmth than usual. Others turned their backs, pretending to busy themselves with chores. It was subtle, but Anthony could feel the shift. The silent lines drawn between those who wanted change and those who preferred comfort. One morning, as he coiled his extension cord, Mr. Johnson crossed the street. His expression was uneasy, as if the words he carried had been rehearsed too many times. "Anthony," he began, scratching the back of his neck, "I want to say I was wrong to stand by during all that. I should have spoken sooner." Anthony studied him for a moment. "Then why didn't you?" Mr. Johnson sighed. "Because I didn't want conflict. It's easier to let things slide than get in the middle." Anthony's voice was steady. "Easier for you, maybe, but not for me." The neighbor's shoulders slumped. "You're right, and I'll do better next time." Anthony nodded once. "That's all anyone can promise." Later that week, while Charlotte was pruning the front hedges, Lorraine herself walked slowly down the sidewalk. Her steps lacked the authority they once carried. She paused at the edge of the Durand's driveway, sunglasses nowhere in sight. Charlotte spotted her first. "Lorraine! Charlotte!" Lorraine's voice was quiet, almost careful. She shifted her gaze toward Anthony, who stood on the porch with a toolbox. "Anthony, may I speak with you?" He hesitated, then set the toolbox down and approached. The air between them felt fragile, like a glass that could shatter with the wrong word. "I've been thinking," Lorraine began. "What I did, I can't defend it anymore. You're right. It wasn't about safety. It was about control and fear. I let both dictate my actions, and I'm ashamed of that." Anthony didn't interrupt. He wanted her to say every word. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight," she continued. "But I need you to know that I see what I did for what it really was. And I'm sorry. Not just to you, but to your family." Charlotte's eyes softened, though she stayed silent, letting her husband decide. Anthony exhaled slowly. "I don't need perfect neighbors, Lorraine. I just need honest ones. If this apology is real, then show it in how you live next door. That'll mean more than anything you say today." For the first time in days, Lorraine's posture eased. She gave a small nod, then turned back toward her house. Anthony watched her go, unsure if the apology marked a true change or just a temporary truce. But something in her voice, the way it cracked under the weight of her own admission, hinted that perhaps the ground beneath their community was shifting. Slowly, unevenly, but shifting nonetheless. That evening, as the sun painted the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple, Anthony sat with Charlotte on the porch. The keypad lock glowed faintly in the twilight. Charlotte broke the silence. But deep down, he knew this story wasn't just about one night or one call. It was about what happens when ordinary people are forced to choose between silence and truth, and how those choices shape the place they all call home. The weeks that followed carried a strange quiet through the neighborhood. Not the comfortable kind, but the sort of silence that holds weight, where people measure their words more carefully, where greetings at mailboxes become longer or shorter, depending on who's involved. Anthony noticed the shifts everywhere. Mrs. Callahan stopped by more often, bringing over extra lemons from her backyard tree, as though her small gestures were a way of reinforcing solidarity. Mr. Johnson waved every time he saw Anthony, his hand lingering in the air, almost apologetic. The Reynolds kids shouted, "Hi, Mr. Durand," from their bikes, as if to prove to their parents that they weren't afraid to be seen with him. But not everyone changed. A few neighbors kept their distance, offering thin smiles that evaporated before reaching their eyes. Anthony could feel it, the divide between those who understood what had happened and those who wanted to sweep it under the rug. One evening, while Anthony was repairing a flickering porch light, Charlotte came outside holding a letter. "You'll want to read this," she said, handing it to him. The envelope bore the HOA seal. Anthony braced himself, half expecting a reprimand disguised as formality. Instead, the letter addressed the entire community. Recent events have highlighted the importance of fairness, communication, and respect within our neighborhood. The board recognizes that our strength lies not in suspicion, but in trust. Moving forward, all concerns about suspicious activity should be approached with direct communication first, before escalating to emergency services. Anthony read it twice, letting the words sink in. "Well," he muttered. "That's one way to save face." Charlotte leaned against the railing. "Even if it's political, it's progress. At least they're admitting something has to change." Anthony folded the letter, slipping it back into the envelope. Change written on paper doesn't mean change lived in action. Still, he couldn't deny a small part of him felt relief. The letter wouldn't erase what happened, but it was acknowledgement, something he hadn't expected. That night, as he and Charlotte sat on the couch, Julian dropped by. Off duty, dressed in jeans and a polo, he carried himself differently. Lighter, but with the same steady seriousness in his eyes. "Dad," he said, settling into the armchair. "I've been thinking about that night, about how it could have gone if it wasn't me responding." Anthony's stomach tightened. "I've thought about that too. More than I'd like." Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's why I became a cop, because I wanted to be the one who showed up, the one who saw the truth instead of assumptions. But I can't be everywhere, and not every officer is going to look past the surface." Charlotte's voice was soft. "Which is why what happened here matters. People saw what assumptions can do. Maybe it'll stick with them next time." Anthony studied his son, pride and pain mixing in his chest. "I hate that you had to be the one in uniform that night, but I'm grateful it was you." Julian gave a faint smile. "Me too. But Dad, don't carry it alone. This wasn't just your burden. It was the neighborhood's. And whether they admit it or not, they all have to live with what they saw." Anthony let the words settle, then nodded. "You're right. Still, some silences speak louder than apologies." Julian leaned back. "Then let that silence teach them. You already did your part. You stood tall when you could have walked away. People remember that." Later, after Julian left, Anthony sat on the porch again. The night was cooler, a soft breeze rustling the mesquite tree by the curb. He thought about Lorraine, about the moment her voice cracked in the meeting. He thought about neighbors who said nothing, and those who finally found the courage to speak. Charlotte joined him, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" Anthony stared at the keypad lock, glowing faintly by the door. "I'm thinking about how trust is fragile, how it takes years to build but one call to shatter, and how we've got to decide every day whether to rebuild or just let the cracks spread." Charlotte rested her head against his shoulder. "And what do you choose?" Anthony's voice was steady, almost quiet. "I choose to keep standing on this porch, no matter who's watching, because this is home, and I won't let suspicion take that away." But deep down, he knew the story didn't belong to him alone anymore. It belonged. 2 months later, life in the subdivision looked ordinary again. Lawns trimmed, sprinklers sputtering to life at dawn, dogs tugging their owners down the sidewalks. To anyone driving through, it might have seemed like nothing unusual had ever happened. But Anthony knew better. Beneath the surface, the neighborhood still carried the echo of that night, like a bruise that never quite faded. On a Saturday morning, Anthony was on his front porch repairing a loose railing when Mr. Johnson stopped by. He had a grocery bag in one hand, a hesitant smile on his face. "Morning, Anthony," he said. "Got some extra oranges from the farmer's market. Thought you might like a few." Anthony took the bag, nodding slowly. "Thanks. Appreciate it." Mr. Johnson lingered, shifting on his feet. "I've been meaning to say, I've thought a lot about what happened, about how I just stood there. I don't want to be that guy again. Next time something's wrong, I'll speak up." Anthony studied him for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "That's all anyone can promise. Do better next time." As Johnson walked away, Anthony placed the oranges on the porch table. Charlotte came out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What was that?" "An attempt at redemption," Anthony replied. She chuckled softly. "Seems like the whole neighborhood's been trying those lately." Later that afternoon, Anthony decided to take a walk. He passed kids tossing a football in the street, their laughter sharp and clear against the Arizona sky. He passed Mrs. Callahan, who waved warmly as she clipped roses in her yard. Even Lorraine, watering her plants, gave him a small nod. Not friendly, not distant. Something in between. Anthony paused, watching her for a moment. She looked older somehow, the sharp edges of her authority dulled. When she noticed his gaze, she lowered her watering can. "Anthony," she said quietly. He responded with a simple, "Lorraine." No more needed to be said. Not then, at least. As he continued down the block, Anthony thought about how much had changed. Not in sweeping, dramatic ways, but in small shifts. People seemed more cautious with their assumptions, more careful with their words. The letter from the HOA still sat pinned on his fridge. Not because he trusted it fully, but because it reminded him that change starts with acknowledgement, however imperfect. When he returned home, Julian was sitting on the porch steps in plain clothes, sipping a bottle of water. "Thought I'd stop by," his son said, smiling. "Didn't want to let too much time go before checking in." Anthony sat beside him. "You don't have to babysit me, son." "I'm fine." Julian shook his head. "It's not babysitting. It's respect." That night, it stuck with me. Made me think about how many times things go the other way. I've seen calls where people weren't lucky enough to have a familiar face show up. Anthony let that sink in. He'd thought the same thing many times, usually late at night when the house was quiet. Julian added, "But maybe what happened here can ripple out. Maybe it'll make people hesitate before assuming the worst. That's worth something." Anthony glanced at his son, pride etched across his face. "You're right. Maybe the lesson isn't just for this block. Maybe it's bigger than that." Charlotte joined them with 2 glasses of iced tea, handing one to Anthony. She sat on the railing, listening as father and son shared the kind of silence that didn't weigh heavy. It comforted. Finally, Anthony broke it. "If there's one thing I want people to remember from all this, it's simple. Ask before you assume. Respect before you accuse. And never forget that every house on this street is more than bricks and paint. It's a family, a story, a life that deserves dignity." Charlotte reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "That's the lesson, Anthony. That's what will last." He raised his glass of tea slightly, as if making a quiet toast. To better neighbors. To better choices. Julian lifted his water bottle in return. And to never letting silence excuse what's wrong. The 3 of them sat together as the evening settled in. Porch light glowing against the deepening sky. Anthony knew the neighborhood might never be perfect. People would still argue about weeds, parking, and paint colors. But what had happened that night, what everyone had seen, was burned into memory. And sometimes memory is what keeps people accountable,